Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Live Econ Guy. Today, I want to talk about why we have inflation and how do we stop inflation. So, I'm sure you all hear about it. You see in the supermarket, things are getting more expensive. Recently, the inflation report came out, so the consumer price index summary, and what we saw is essentially we had a slight decrease in inflation from 6.4% year over year last month to 6.0% in March. So not too much progress, nothing to kind of boast about, I would say. Also, the jobs report came out, so unemployment inched up slightly to 3.6%. So not too much progress. The Fed thinks that it's going to be long and bumpy ride, so it's not going to be an easy fix to fix inflation. I mean, some people think that, okay, you're just going to increase interest rates to where inflation is. So right now it's like 6%, so maybe increase it to 5.5 or so, and inflation is defeated. That's not quite how it works, and I'm sure a lot of you heard about banks failing and the Federal Reserve and essentially the executive branch coming in and injecting liquidity into the system. So and this is really important, because why do we have inflation in the first place? You're going to hear a lot of things like supply chain issues, etc. And by the way, if you're going to say that inflation is because of supply chain issues, I'm going to ask you, why do we have supply chain issues in the first place? So you're going to say, people going out and buying a lot of stuff. Well, why are people going out and buying a lot of stuff? They have access to money, access to loans. Why do they have access to money and access to loans? Well, in recent times, the government has been very accommodative. Interest rates have been very low, and everyone's been getting stimulus checks, etc. The jobs market is crazy, so everyone has money. And I'll show you how money directly predicts inflation. So speaking of money, this is the M2 money supply. So this is essentially currency in circulation. So currently we have like $21 trillion in circulation, and believe it or not, the last year or so has been the first time that this actually decreased, if you look at this graph. So, and by the way, the M2 was updated recently. So like a year ago or 2 years ago, they updated it from being monthly to from being updated weekly to on a monthly basis. So, but guys, you kind of see what happened during the pandemic. So we had this, and actually before the pandemic as well. I think the system broke down around mid 2000. From like 2018 to 2019, because interest rates were going up and liquidity was being reduced. So the Fed was kind of selling assets and letting their bonds run off. So they started quantitative easing right here, right before the pandemic. Then the pandemic happens, the perfect storm that they needed, and they just inject trillions of dollars into the system. And then around the start of 2022, everyone sees inflation is going crazy. So they start to allow the balance sheet to run off and try to take liquidity out of the system. This is the same graph M2, but we're looking at percent change year over year. So you kind of see right here, this is around when the system started to break down, kind of a similar situation that we have today. So they were trying to take liquidity out of the system. So they were injecting less and less and less money over time, and pretty much things broke, and they started injecting money into the system. COVID hits around here. They get the perfect storm. They just do all the biggest quantitative easing ever, inject trillions into the trillions of dollars of currency into circulation. This is the federal funds effective rate, so you can kind of seen this a lot, and this is what's happening currently. The Federal Reserve has been hiking interest rates to around 4.5 to 4.75%. That's their target, but as you could see in the recent past, it's been really just zero. Essentially, that's been their target. I also want to show you the percent change in consumer price index. So this is essentially inflation. So as you've all seen, inflation was just raging. It was over 9% last year. and currently it edged down to around 6%, which is from the inflation report that we saw previously. Next, guys, I want to show you the interaction between the three. You kind of see exactly why inflation happens. So this is going to be the percent change in M2 year over year. So that's the currency in circulation. You're also looking at the red line, which is the consumer price index change year over year, and just the federal funds effective rate, the percentage. So I want to show you guys kind of what happened the last time that we had major inflation crisis. So take a look at the blue line and the red line around the 70s. So from the 70s to the mid 80s. So it's a direct predictor, right? You have giant growth in the M2 money supply, so currency in circulation. And a few years later, so not right away, but a few years later, you have a giant jump in inflation. So this follows, oops, let me fix this real quick. So this follows by a decrease in the M2 money supply, a decrease in the year-over-year growth of the M2 money supply, but inflation still keeps skyrocketing. And then inflation starts falling, and that concurrently results in, again, an increase in the year-over-year growth of currency in circulation, and then inflation skyrockets again. So what this does, it's essentially a predictor of inflation. So you have a growth in year-over-year currency in circulation, and a few years down the road, inflation skyrockets. So that's just how things happen. And if you keep looking at this graph, essentially the little caveat here is the federal funds rate. So sometimes they raise it, sometimes they lower it to try to have an impact on inflation, but it doesn't always work. So if you look at the 2010s, you had the federal funds rate basically flat, so at 0%, but inflation didn't really go up. Throughout the 2010s, there's been issues with raising inflation, so it was really low. As you could see in like 2015, it's basically zero, and it didn't really help that they had federal funds rate essentially at zero. You still had really low inflation. What I want to show you, and I mentioned things breaking in 2019, what happened was they did quantitative tightening, so assets rolled off of the Federal Reserve balance sheet, so that lowered the amount of currency in circulation. At the same time, they started to hike interest rates. So at essentially around 2018, early 2019, the system quote unquote broke. So banks started going illiquid and they had to start injecting money again. Now look at this. In early 2019, they start injecting money. Inflation doesn't instantly go up, right? It takes a lag, and inflation starts to go up maybe 2 years later. So you do quantitative easing, 2 years later you get the result. So it's not instant. Same thing happened with the COVID quantitative easing. So you increase the amount of M2 by a massive amount, and here it was essentially 26% year over year increase. So guys, it just skyrocketed. The amount of M2 I kind of showed you right here went from maybe $15.5 trillion to like $21.5 trillion of currency in circulation. So this pretty much predicted this giant CPI growth, inflation growth that we saw in 2022. So guys, you see, following this massive decrease, it looks like a massive decrease year over year, but it's not really that much. As you can see from the raw data, it's decreasing, but not by much. Why is this decreasing? A lot of it has to do with the balance sheet roll-off and the Fed selling inflation bonds, and not the Fed, the Treasury Department selling inflation bonds. So they're kind of taking currency out of the system, trying to lower the M2 money supply without impacting GDP. I think that's the only way out of this situation, is to keep GDP high or at least flat, and then reduce the M2 money supply. So you have to have both of these. Now, how do you have both of these? It's really difficult because history shows that when when the money supply goes down, interest rates go up, that results in a recession. You kind of see this around here. So they hiked interest rates, M2 money supply was pretty flat, went up a little bit maybe, that resulted in a recession. Kind of same situation here, large growth in interest rates results in a recession, etc. So guys, the ultimate kind of answer to inflation, is stop spending, lower spending, and stop essentially injecting currency into circulation. So why does Jerome Powell say that the fight is going to be bumpy? Well, you kind of saw recently what happened. Banks failed. The Fed comes in and covers, injects liquidity into the system. I think like $300 billion was recently injected due to the Silicon Valley Bank failure. So, he's trying to pull money out of the system, circulation, he's trying to pull currency out of circulation by doing the balance sheet runoff, but then the government comes in and just injects $300 billion into circulation. So that kind of shows you, this $300 billion is going to be felt 2 years down the road. So you're thinking, nothing really happened. Inflation is still edging down, so we can continue to inject money into the system. Well, if you do that, you get the 1970s, right? You get the same thing happening as happened in 1970. So you think you defeated inflation at around right here. So you inject a lot of money and you're like, okay, this is all right. This isn't really causing inflation to go up. 2 years down the road, inflation skyrockets again. So really, guys, the answer is take money out of circulation. Take currency out of circulation. Interest rate hikes help. Why do they help? Because the interest rate for loans, for mortgages goes up. And you go to a bank, the bank might not even give you that loan. So currency is created when you can get loans. So for the last 10 years or so, it's been really easy to get loans, which is what's been injecting currency into circulation. So what we need to do is we need to stop giving loans and take currency out of circulation. Not easy to do. That's going to essentially cause a recession. Because, GDP goes down if spending goes down. If you can't get loans, you can't spend. And as a result, you have a recession. So personally, I think that, they're not going to continue to bail out banks. That's my kind of opinion, because it requires for the Treasury Department, for the Federal Reserve, and for the executive branch to come in and kind of all agree that, hey, we're going to bail you out. I think this is going to be a one-off, SVB getting bailed out. I think it's like a warning signal for other banks, like, hey, if you're not leveraging, if you're heavily invested into Treasury securities, you better start thinking about, realigning your portfolios. So that's kind of the situation here, guys. This is why inflation happens, is you inject currency into circulation. A few years down the road, that currency has an impact and inflation goes up. So we need to, for some time, we need to decrease the year-over-year amounts of currency in circulation. And a few years down the road, maybe in 2025, 26, we will actually see inflation getting tamed. But if we keep injecting money into circulation, you're going to see a similar thing. You're going to see inflation going down, and then it's going to go back up. So hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully the Federal Reserve does their job and they learn from the past lessons. So that's that. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below and let me know. Otherwise, see you soon.